A fierce conflict is raging in Somalia. US Special Forces have been plunged into a devastating humanitarian crisis, providing a golden opportunity for local warlords to seize control of the country's capital, Mogadishu. Among them is the infamous Mohamed Farrah Aidid. The city is burning. The impending chaos can be felt in the air. Suddenly, 160 elite American soldiers are cornered by the mobilization of 4,000 fighters loyal to the fearsome leader. As helicopters hover overhead, trying to secure a retreat, Uncle Sam's soldiers are forced to fight an enemy who knows every corner of the city and is thirsty for their blood. In this new video from Military Force, we'll learn about the bloody Battle of Mogadishu, an intense confrontation that ended the lives of almost 20 American soldiers and caused the loss of 500 Somali warriors. Grab your helmet and join us as we uncover all about this wild episode. Let's get started. October 3, 1993. The capital of Somalia, Mogadishu, was devastated by years of civil war. The oppressive heat waves were nothing compared to the fire that burned the streets. A labyrinth of rubble, ruined buildings, and improvised barriers took care of finishing off the sinister picture. From above, American Black Hawk helicopters glided through the air like predators in search of their prey, casting their threatening shadow over a city that would soon be submerged in a new maelstrom of violence, never seen before. The soldiers on board belonged to the elite American forces, the lethal Delta Force and the fierce Army Rangers. Both special units are highly prepared, accustomed to demanding training that makes them relentless in different direct action operations. They are usually deployed in scenarios where they must face heavily armed targets in counterterrorism missions, always with great efficiency and high levels of success. However, this time they will encounter an enormous challenge. Everyone rode in the aircraft in silence, checking their weapons, adjusting their bulletproof vests, and watching through the small windows. They studied every inch of the capital as they bided their time. They knew that these streets would soon be transformed into a real battlefield. In the region were two of the top lieutenants of the ruthless Somali warlord, Mohamed Farrah Aidid. This man was in charge of one of the groups fighting for control of the country. They had defied the United Nations and the northern country, which was intervening to counter the devastating situation in Somalia. As a result, the lieutenants unleashed an escalation of violence that had claimed hundreds of lives. The mission of the elite forces was clear: capture them at any cost.
Somalia has always been clan warfare. The different clans were trying to compete to own Somalia. Well, one of the ways you could do that was to own the supplies that are now coming in to feed the famine. Aidid and his clan started to hit some of the UN supply lines trying to take these goods. They ended up slaughtering a bunch of Pakis, part of the UN process. After killing the Pakis, the UN Task Force Ranger was formed, trained specifically to go after Aidid.
Action was imminent. The planning of the operation seemed impeccable. One of those missions that the Special Forces had carried out time and time again, calculated to the millimeter and always with success. But the enemy was not a conventional army. It was a chaotic mix of armed militias, angry civilians, and veteran guerrillas who knew every corner of Mogadishu. That knowledge and mastery of the terrain gained from their role in the country's civil war would be their greatest advantage over the American troops. Just after 3:30 p.m. on October 3, 1993, the helicopters launched into the descent, enveloping the city in a huge roar. Ropes were deployed from the aircraft, and the soldiers began to slide toward the ground. In less than a minute, the troops were already in position, surrounding the building where the targets were believed to be gathered.
Very orchestrated and very rehearsed. Kick the rope out, and then everybody just starts going. And it's a very fast and very efficient way to get people out.
We just came out of nowhere and dropped into the city. And it was almost that calm before the storm.
The Deltas entered the building. They advanced through the building, moving with the precision and stealth of trained predators. No one seemed to notice them. When they finally found Aidid's men, they threw a smoke grenade. There was confusion among the two surprised lieutenants, and that was the moment to act. The Americans pounced on them, and within minutes they had left the building with their targets in custody. Outside, everything was as quiet as before. It was a resounding success.
It was pretty simple. To get in, capture the targets, and to get out. If the leadership of the country said, this is what we want you guys to go do, that's what I wanted to go do.
We were certainly mentally prepared for it, and we were certainly ready for whatever that they could throw at us.
We went where we wanted to go, and there wasn't anyone there that could tell us or make us do otherwise.
The preparation had been excellent. The soldiers' conviction had led them to achieve their objective in a few minutes, and everything seemed ready for a celebration. But then, something changed. From the surrounding streets, the echo of the first shot resounded among the ruins of the buildings. Suddenly, that isolated sound became a volley of bullets that pierced the stillness of the afternoon like a blast of metal. The Somali militiamen, who until then seemed absent, came out of nowhere. Emerging from the shadows and alleys like a swarm of angry bees. The fire was intense and disorderly, but that only made it even more dangerous. The attack came from all directions. The Rangers, deployed in the streets as a covering force, immediately found themselves under an unimaginable curtain of projectiles. Bullets from AK-47 rifles whistled around them, hitting walls and smashing into vehicles that had been used to block the various access routes to the target area. The American soldiers responded with their own fire, but it soon became clear that they were facing a much larger group than they had anticipated. An initial force of 160 elite American troops found themselves facing an onslaught of around 4,000 enemy fighters. The MH-6 Little Bird helicopters assigned to the mission began firing bursts of rockets and machine gun fire to try to disperse the attackers. However, the Somali militants were not willing to give in. Every bullet fired from the skies was answered with a new wave of gunfire from rooftops, windows, and alleys. The streets of Mogadishu, normally full of life, became a battlefield where death lurked around every corner. And it was only just beginning. The breaking point was about to arrive.
Every second the Americans spend in the danger zone gives the Somalis time to bring in more militiamen. And they have a lethal surprise for Task Force Ranger.
The first fatal blow came at 4:20 p.m., almost an hour into the operation. An RPG missile fired from the streets into the air traced a deadly spiral, heading straight for one of the American helicopters. In this case, it was one of the force's most emblematic units, a Black Hawk, designated by its crew as the Super 61. The impact was immediate and devastating. The rotor stopped and the aircraft began to fall out of control. A steel monster was losing its battle against gravity. The crew and the soldiers on board barely had time to react. Within seconds, they crashed to the ground in the heart of Mogadishu, which by then was already shrouded in a cloud of smoke and dust.
what you see is chaos and you see confusion, and that was real. That was the day. The whole time we were there, I always thought that there's a law of probability that if they shoot enough rockets, they're going to shoot a helicopter down. I heard it on the radio before I saw the aircraft. We've been hit, and then some more followed up with bird down, bird down, bird down.
The impact was brutal and the chaos escalated. The forces on the ground knew they had to reach the wreckage of the helicopter, rescue the survivors, and establish a defensive perimeter. But every meter they advanced toward the objective was a deadly challenge. The Somali militants continued to launch fierce assaults on the various American positions, taking advantage of the large number of attackers with shots coming from all directions. The snipers, hidden among the ruins, carefully selected their targets, taking down the soldiers one by one. Sergeant Dominic Pilla, a young ranger soldier, moved with his squad along a narrow street, unaware that he was in the sights of a bloodthirsty sniper. The enemy waited with their finger on the trigger, waiting for the right moment. A well-aimed shot hit Pilla in the head. His death was quick, but the emotional impact on his companions was devastating. It was only seconds, but the silence that was generated in the middle of the chaos seemed like an eternity. There was no time to mourn the loss, however. The battle was far from over. The troops had to get to the crash site as quickly as possible. Although the pilots were dead, part of the crew was still alive. Seriously wounded, they were trying to hold out under enemy fire, waiting for reinforcements to arrive, which were slowly advancing. The soldiers tried to make their way through the Somali militias with fierce bursts of fire that cleared the way and left the streets littered with corpses. Finally, at 16:40, they managed to reach the area to provide assistance. Just at that moment, when the Americans thought things couldn't get any worse, the second big blow came. While the soldiers were trying to create a perimeter around the downed helicopter, another RPG missile traced a lethal trajectory in the sky. This time the target was the Super 64, a new Black Hawk that was patrolling over the area, and it began a violent fall. Like its predecessor, it had been hit full force by the impact, and in a second the spiral descent made it another protagonist of the ruins in Mogadishu. The impact was just as devastating, but this time the situation was even more desperate. 2 helicopters downed, dozens of soldiers trapped in the midst of a swarm of enemies, and every passing minute brought more and more Somali militants onto the battlefield. The American troops, designed for fast and precise raids, were now in the middle of a war of attrition to which they were not accustomed. The terrain was extremely hostile, and there was no possibility of being supported by immediate reinforcements. Chaos had taken over the operation. Little bird helicopters continued to launch attacks from above, but each missile and each bullet only managed to delay the inevitable. The Somali fighters continued to arrive, like an unstoppable tide. The narrow, winding streets of the capital had been transformed into death traps where American soldiers were hunted like helpless prey. The American commandos on the ground faced a fight without quarter. The original strategy of the operation had completely collapsed. The soldiers, divided into small groups, desperately tried to defend their wounded comrades and secure the positions where the helicopters had fallen. Despite this, heroism was not absent among the American ranks, who, at a clear numerical disadvantage, continued to risk themselves for their colleagues. One of the most impressive moments of the battle occurred when 2 Delta Force snipers named Gary Gordon and Randy Shugart requested to be inserted at the site of the second Black Hawk that had been shot down. The place was completely surrounded by Somali militiamen, but they knew that the crew of the aircraft had no chance of surviving without support on the ground. Despite the warnings of their superiors, Gordon and Shugart persisted. Fur soldiers were dropped off at the crash site by another helicopter, knowing they would probably not make it out alive. Armed with sniper rifles and a limited supply of ammunition, they defended the fallen giant and its occupants. For hours, they managed to hold off dozens of attackers. When they noticed their bullets were running out, they knew the end was near. But they didn't care. They continued to fire without ceasing. Each enemy that fell was a crucial victory. The last rounds were ejected just an instant before they were shot down. Their sacrifice was a demonstration of the courage and determination of the American Special Forces at that moment of maximum tension. And in the future, it earned them the recognition of the posthumous Medal of Honor. Regardless of the heroic act of these Delta soldiers, the fight continued. Each step the Americans took was greeted by a storm of bullets. Casualties mounted. Wounded soldiers, their faces covered in blood, continued to advance, knowing that retreat was not an option. As the hours passed, the supply of American ammunition was rapidly dwindling. The situation became critical as the militants did not stop. The streets remained a battlefield with gunfire and explosions lighting up the city. Eventually, several armored vehicles arrived on the scene. They had been sent for extraction, but the challenge they faced was as great as that of the troops deployed for hours. Rescue convoys tried to make their way through the narrow streets, but every block was a new ambush. Somali RPGs and grenades hit them, while soldiers inside the vehicles fired frantically through the small slits. The chaos was palpable. The wounded screamed in pain, while combat medics did everything they could to stop the bleeding and prevent death. The tension was unsustainable. Everyone knew they were fighting an uphill battle, in a city that seemed to have engulfed them. However, just when it seemed there would be no escape, a new convoy managed to open a corridor to the American positions. It was a UN force made up of Pakistani and Malaysian troops. This was a ray of hope in the midst of the darkness. The wounded and exhausted fighters were evacuated, many of them on the verge of collapse. Little by little, the sound of gunfire faded away. The last ones were heard when the morning of October 4th, 1993, showed the first glimmers of sunlight. By the end of the battle, Mogadishu was a scene of death and destruction. The streets were strewn with rubble, wrecked vehicles, and corpses, both Somalis and Americans. The mission, which should have lasted just 60 minutes, had turned into a nightmare of almost 18 hours of brutal combat. The cost was devastating. A total of 18 American soldiers had been killed and more than 70 wounded. However, their enemies also paid a heavy price. An estimated 500 militants died on the field, while nearly 3,000 were left with injuries of varying severity. For the United States, the battle for Mogadishu was a turning point. Images of slain troops being dragged through the streets by angry mobs sparked a wave of outrage. Military intervention in Somalia was quickly reconsidered, and within months, American forces were withdrawn from the country. Meanwhile, the confrontation also left deep scars on the African capital. The city, already torn by civil war, continued to sink into violence. Mohamed Farrah Aidid, though weakened by the operation, remained a figure of power, and the deadly conflict would continue with new factions fighting for control of a devastated nation. Now, after learning the story behind the deadly battle in which 2 Blackhawks were shot down, it's time to say goodbye. Thank you very much for staying with us until the end. We look forward to seeing you again in our next military force video.